I've bodged these together, and if the bodge has become too obvious, I apologize for that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk, because I'm talking about Norman tactics in general, I'm actually going to start off talking about the Battle of Hastings, which most of you, of course, will know about and have thought about before. Then I'm going to go on and talk largely about the Normans fighting the Byzantines in the south. I'm going to mention them fighting the Lombards and the Arabs, which I do in more detail in my academic work. But there ain't no pictures and there ain't no maps. And so it doesn't really make for a particularly satisfactory presentation like this. And if there's time, I'll come back and talk about one particular battle between the Normans and the Byzantines, which is the Battle of Dyrrhachium, or Duratzo, or Duresh, which in modern Albania, between Robert Guiscard and the Emperor Alexius I Komnenos. Anyway, so I'm going to start off, I'm going to crash into the Battle of Hastings, because I wrote this, as I say, for a wargaming magazine, and I just try and use some of that material. Oops, I'm not sure I wanted that. Yep. Yes, oh, that's right. I will just say something about the stereotype Normans to begin with. I mean, one of the issues about the Normans is they're seen as charging heavy cavalry, which they were. However, it does not follow that they were necessarily reckless, uncontrollable, or one-shot weapons. I mean, generally, you don't get many charges out of any cavalry at any period. My hero, Richard the Lionheart, managed to get 3 charges out of his cavalry at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, but that's almost unheard of. However, they are not simply a one-shot weapon, and they're a lot more controlled and organized than perhaps they might be depicted on the war games table. Reasons for why they're stereotyped is sometimes just simply misunderstanding the iconography. In other words, lots of people charging with lances means lots of people charging with lances, but they don't show you all the other things that those people did. A simplistic reading of sources, in the same sense, the contemporary sources, misapplied archaeology, for example, an obsession with the stirrup, and an idea that was around really in the 70s, but until squashed by Bernard Bachrach, that you couldn't really charge with a lance unless you had a stirrup. Monocausal interpretations, in other words, that the charging knight was the triumphant figure, and beyond, and no other troops could survive it until the English so-called longbow turns up. And so, it's a lot more sophisticated than that. Popular historical representations that we're all used to, in other words, the charging knights, and to a certain extent, nationalistic obsessions as well, about, we're top dogs, so therefore at the top we must always have been top dogs in fighting. So stereotypes are often based on realities, and certainly this is a presentation that the Franks, I'll call them the Franks, the people living in what we now call France, of which the Normans were only a subset. Wherever the Normans went, they decorated their churches with pictures like this one. This one comes from the cathedral at Bari, and it actually shows on the left a Frankish hero, possibly Roland from Roland, the Song of Roland, Roland and Oliver, unhorsing a Saracen, or in other words, a Muslim in this context. And you can see that the Frank has got his conical helmet, and he has a long shield, which is behind his back, projecting behind. He's got his feet deep in his stirrups. He's holding his lance absolutely horizontal and thrusting it through the body of the enemy there, the Saracen enemy, whose feet have been thrown out of the stirrups by the impact. You can tell he's a Saracen because he's got a sissy little round shield rather than a proper kite shield that they had. So, I mean, it is their own story as much as anything that we need to think about. But don't get taken in by all of it, I would say. I'm going to say a little bit now about the Battle of Hastings, and I'm going to jump right in, no background. And on the day of Hastings, the 14th of October, 1066, the English are described as forming in very close order, One of the most closest contemporary source is something called the Song of the Battle of Hastings, written by an abbot who was a close associate of William the Conqueror, but especially his wife Matilda. They worked together on sort of, many intellectual and architectural projects. So he has a story which is written possibly even as close as a year after the event. The English come rushing out of the woods on the hill at a place that we now call Battle, because for obvious reasons, advanced in a dense mass to take up a position. Harold's command post was on the summit, marked by his standards. His brothers, Gerf and Leofwine, commanded on the flank, surrounded by their Hearthguard, their housecarls. And these, of course, were the best English warriors who fought in groups or teams using different combinations of weapons, spears, javelins, and Danish axes, as I'll show you later on the tapestry. Now, King Harold, having served with William just a couple of years earlier, when he was a kind of a hostage, a political hostage, having served with him in Brittany, he had a very good idea of the kind of generalship he was going to meet. But he may have been surprised by the large number of archers that William had recruited. And so this is why I'm showing this particular slide, which is the approach to contact from the Normans. And you can see the cavalry and the archers. The guy in the bottom left of that group in armor, with his feet together, in other words, not braced to shoot a bow, is almost certainly a representation of a crossbowman, not an archer, by somebody who wasn't particularly certain what a crossbow looked like. And for further support of that, if you look in his left hand, you see he's holding 4 little short quarrels. Anyway, just a point that there were crossbowmen at the Battle of Hastings, and that's important because their bolts, their heavy bolts, could actually penetrate shields in the way that archers could not. But what Harold had probably intended to do was to take the sting out of the Norman cavalry, which he knew were dangerous, by having a dense formation of foot. And so as long as they kept in good order, and it may be that his plan was just to stand on the hill and wait until the Normans had exhausted themselves. And at that point, the English could advance and pin the Normans against the woods on the other side of the valley. He must have been aware that foot advancing against formed cavalry without cohesion would be ridden down. And so he may well have tried to order there would be no advance until there were no fresh Norman cavalry in the field. William of Poitiers, who's another contemporary source, in actual fact, he was one of William's chaplains. So that makes him right absolutely shoulder to shoulder with Duke William, later King William. He says there were 3 divisions, and you'll all probably be aware of this. The Bretons on the left flank, the Normans, the larger group in the center under their duke, and the French on the right. There's a lot of people who weren't Normans serving in the army, but they are Franks and they fight in the same way. They were also arranged in 3 lines, archer and crossbowmen in the front line, then infantry soldiers armored and in close order, and then the mounted knights. So you might say to yourselves, well, why aren't there any infantrymen shown on the Bayeux tapestry? And all I can suggest is that the spearmen, which we know were there and which formed an important part of the army, were sort of cut out of the story for simplicity. The story of the Bayeux tapestry is the horsemen and the archers win the battle, right? And so therefore the foot soldiers don't appear. That's my suggestion anyway. But as we know, the initial archery attacks didn't have much impact. You're shooting at men in the front ranks, at least, who have long metal coats and big shields, and shooting uphill. And so we know that happened. And then there's an attack by the infantry, the English replying with throwing hand axes and stones tied to sticks. There they are. The infantry, as I say, don't appear in the pictures, but the thing that really frightened the Normans were the great axes, which I'll show you sort of in the next slide. So the English are helped by their great numbers, dense formation, and especially their weapons. The formation was so dense, says William of Poitiers, that the dead were unable to fall. Then the attackers began to fall back. it's not quite clear whether this was done on purpose, but I'm quite happy with the sort of the general line that the Bretons on the left broke because they weren't used to this heavy fighting, and there are reasons for arguing that, and fled. As a result, there's nearly chaos in the. So there we are. Cavalry cannot break. Oops, let's go back. Cavalry cannot break formed infantry, and there's a man with a big axe, right? So that's the next one that I wanted to show you. But what happens is that according to the song of the battle, the French, versed in stratagem, skilled in warfare, pretend to fly as if defeated. The English, rusticagens, sort of a peasant folk, rejoice and believing that they have won. They pursue them with naked swords. So anyway, he says that an intentional withdrawal turned into a rout. What then happens, of course, is that the people who do pursue, and the tapestry depicts these people all as less well armored. So, that may well be right that the housecarls had more sense than go running after cavalry. And they do turn up by a tapestry on a hill where they get surrounded and cut down. But the whole point is that once they get off their own hill and below it, they can be picked off by the mounted men. The bishop, Bishop Guy, I think I said he was an abbot earlier, doesn't conceive of the battle taking places in phases. He just gives the story. William of Poitiers, though, was actually an old warrior. He had been a knight, and then he converted to the church on his retirement, something that military men still do today, actually. So he understands that once the infantry are scattered, they can be ridden down by the knights. The problem was that the rout in this particular area infected all of William's army, and you got some of the knights, especially the younger ones, running back, saying the Duke had been killed. There you see Bishop Odo, who's William's rather pugnacious bishop brother, rallying them. And I just want to make a quick point. He's not got a club. That is his baton of command. That's a pointy stick that you use to point the direction for people. So that tells you he's in command. And he's also not wearing armor. So the tapestry he's wearing probably a poor point that you wore underneath. The tapestry is making a point that he's not actually fighting, but he is in command, which might seem a fine distinction, but it is important for this period. So he's rallying the knights there. And also, there's a famous picture of Duke William, who, having been said he'd been killed, rides up and down in front of the army with his helmet, lifting the big nasal on his helmet, lifting it up and saying that he's still alive. And next to him, you can see his standard bearer with what is probably a papal banner given to them by Pope Alexander II because of the justice of their cause. And there you have Eustace of Boulogne, another ally, pointing at him and saying he's still alive. And then in the bottom of that picture, and this is why it's significant, you can see some archers coming back into the fight. Now, it's pointed out to me by a guy called Sandy Heslop, who's an art historian some 20 years ago, that most of those guys are not coloured in. So what you say? Well, when elsewhere in the tapestry, Harold is told about the invasion that William's planning, there are ghostly ships, as they're called, ships that are not coloured in at the bottom of the tapestry. And apart from the one guy who has got coloured in by accident, what you've got there is something that suggests that these people are sort of operating secretly or unseen. In other words, it is, in Baldric's terms, a cunning plan. It's a tactic. The tactic is that once the Normans can get their act together, they can combine the cavalry and the archers properly. There is this point, though, about the feigned flight. Now, some people will tell you that it's too difficult for cavalry to do feigned flight. I would tell you that most cavalry all the time are capable of doing it, as long as they're reasonably well trained. And if they're very well trained, then they'll be very good at it. And certainly William of Poitiers, who remember is a former knight and soldier, says, When the Normans and their troops saw that they could not conquer such a solidly massed enemy force without heavy loss, they wheeled around and deliberately feigned flight. They remembered how, a little while before, their flight had brought about the result they desired. There was jubilation amongst the barbarians, that's the Anglo-Danes, for you and me, who hoped for a great victory. Encouraging each other with joyful shouts, they heaped curses on our men and threatened to destroy them forthwith. As before, some thousands of them dared to rush, almost as if they were winged in pursuit of those they believed to be fleeing. The Normans, suddenly wheeling round their horses, checked and encircled them and slaughtered them to the last man. One of the things to remember is that the Normans were used to operating in small groups called convois, probably of somewhere like 20 or 30 men, and that they, although we have no evidence of actual training practice at the time, a lot of these people hunted together as well, so they would have understood about riding in a mass, and they may well have practiced, we just don't know. That's the thing. There's another thing which is really important for understanding what made the Franks and the Normans such great horsemen, and that was something called the tour francaise in the language of the time, the French turn. Right. Some of you may have seen the French rugby team yesterday tearing great holes into the Irish with their with their speed and agility, and it is somewhat like that. If you know what you're doing with your horse, you can whip it round, move off quickly, and then turn it round again. It's a kind of dressage move, and there are historians who've looked at how much dressage there was actually done in the Middle Ages or the equivalent. But once you understand it can be done, then a feigned flight as an individual and a feigned flight as a group is not as difficult as it might seem. Anyway, William of Poitiers continues. Oh, excuse me, that's my cat. Having used this trick twice with the same result, they attacked the remainder with greater determination. Up until now, the enemy line had been bristling weapons and most difficult to encircle. So a combat of the most unusual kind began, in which one side was rushing to the attack and then turning away, and the other standing firmly as if fixed to the ground. The English grew weak and endured punishment as though confessing their guilt by their defeat. The Normans shot arrows, smote and pierced. The dead by falling seemed to move more than the living. Even those merely wounded were unable to escape, for they were crushed by the closeness of the fellows. So fortune turned to William, hastening his triumph. And then we actually don't get a lot of detail about the feigned flight there, but there's a very interesting source from the mid-12th century, a vernacular poet writing in Anglo-Norman or into the French. He writes a poem called the Roman de Roux, or the story of Rollo, the original Viking who becomes a Norman. And although he himself is not a fighting man, he's a canon of the Cathedral of Bayeux, he's really very interested in how it happened. And I'll just very quickly give you some addition to what he says about the earlier Latin source. Because the French were moving away, the English thought and said that those from France were taking flight and would never return. The feigned flight deceived the English. Because of this flight, great harm accrued. For if they stood firm without moving, that's the English, they would have defended themselves very well and been difficult to overcome. But they dispersed like fools and pursued the Normans like fools. You would have seen the Normans withdrawing with great cunning, slowly retreating to make the English come forward. The Normans fled and the English pursued them with their spears outstretched and their axes raised. There's then a fair amount of very spurious detail about hand-to-hand fighting, but Wace makes a really interesting point about the difference between the French and their continental allies and the Anglo-Danes. The English were not skilled in jousting nor bearing arms on horseback. They carried axes and bills, as in the bow and bill of later periods, called gisarmes at the time, and did battles with such weapons. And then Wace says, because he's obviously thought about it, a man who intends to strike with an axe cannot give his mind to protecting himself, as he has to hold it in both hands if he wishes to strike with great vigor. To strike well and protect oneself at the same time is impossible. which is why you see on the tapestry a combination of men throwing javelins with their shields held to the fore, and those just waving axes. Also, Wace says something really interesting about how the horses would have a tactical impact. You don't get in the Latin sources, but he says that the horse's weight was important. Now, remember, these are not big horses. They're probably less than 15 hands, which is the modern definition of where a horse starts. That's 5 foot at the shoulder, at the withers. But nonetheless, they're quite chunky. A Welsh cob, which you've ever seen one, is quite a fearsome squat beast. Is probably what they were like. So they're quite chunky. And what he says, that one of the Norman champions, quote, using his horse's chest, he sent many men tumbling that day, and as they struggled to their feet, you would have seen him doing good work with his sword. He also celebrates the knight's skill in maneuvering their mounts. One particular guy, he took 2 Englishmen for fools. He knocked one down with his lance and brained another with his sword, spurring his horse and turning so that no Englishman touched him. That's the French turn. So, and the coup de grace in this battle, which of course we will all have seen. Hang on. Anyway, the coup de grace in this battle was delivered in a final charge led by William, with his standard bearer close by and surrounded by his best knights. In close formation, as was their duty, they rode to strike the English with the strength of their good horses, known in Old French as destriers, and the blows of their knights, blows of their swords, I must mean, they completely broke through the throng and sliced through the crowd before them. Many Englishmen fell, lying on the ground and kicking their legs. Those unable to get up were trampled by the enemy's horses. And the final attack was successful because the English the archers had inflicted casualties at close range, and therefore thinned out the English. Now, this is a famous scene. I won't say much about it. It's been debated whether the figure standing with the arrow in his eye is in fact King Harold, as is the one who's being chopped in the leg, which is another source describes that as being the wound. The actual description is that him being wounded on the inner thigh, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, which may have all kinds of implications about his loss of masculinity at the time when he's defeated. Now, this is an old story, and I hope I hope I haven't bored you by telling you the story, because it does tell you a lot about Norman tactics. Norman tactics are not about charging out flat out. They're about clever combinations of arms, and that's what I'm going to prove by having a look at the Byzantine sources as well. Okay, and they're off in pursuit. Which, of course, if you're going to finish an army off, you have to pursue it. And there does seem to have been a particularly bloody pursuit after Hastings, if we can make an assessment of how many top people died. And to a certain extent you can, because of landowners who were no longer available after Hastings, both secular and ecclesiastical. The keen-eyed amongst you will notice there's an archer on a horse there. So if I was a wargamer, like I said, I insist on a unit of horse archers at Hastings. However, I did some research into this and found out that is actually taken from a kind of iconographical snapshot about pursuit. And it just shows pursuit. It's not impossible that somebody mounted up on a horse, but I think it's more likely to be an art historical reference than a military one. Anyway, but if anybody really wants horse archers at Hastings, just don't play them, really. I was going to say a little bit about the fight against the Lombards in Italy, which I won't do, apart from to say that if you want your stereotype Normans there, in actual fact, the Lombards are described as being particularly disorganized and unmilitary. So when the Normans launch a charge at them, as you can see there on the left flank of a papal army there, when they're fighting at the Battle of Civitate just a few years before Hastings, they run away. However, there's a bunch below them called Swabians. These are imperial soldiers who've from the German Empire, who've been sent to hold to help the Pope, and they seem to have dismounted. So what we've got there is a group of what I would say Frankish heavy cavalry who are fighting on foot. And this was something that was not unusual. And in fact, in 12th century Anglo-Norman battles, very often they dismount and fight. Now, there may be some influence from the Anglo-Saxons, or it may be that it was just suitable to do so. And on several occasions, even when a king is present, this is what they do. But we only have one really good source for the Battle of Civitate, which is a Latin poem, and it describes the Swabians, perhaps 700 of them, dismounting and fighting with two-handed swords, which may be a fancy way of saying they were axes, or it may be they did use their swords in that way. But anyway, they are tough in the same way that the Anglo-Saxons proved to be tough, or the English proved to be tough at Hastings, because they fight determinedly and close together. And it takes the Normans a while to break them down, probably because one group of Normans comes back from having pursued the Lombards, but quite possibly because they're using infantry as well in combination. Because I don't have much time, I'm just going to leave that for the moment. And as I said, that there's quite a useful little book, actually, which is that one, which is Paul Brown's book on mercenaries and conquerors, Norman warfare in the 11th and 12th century Mediterranean. And he has some descriptions of fighting in Sicily. The trouble is, the actual Latin texts, which we've got three reasonable texts describing it, are absolutely hopeless for any detail. And they will tell you that it was 150,000 Muslims and 300 Normans, and the Normans won. It's very difficult to give any more detail, apart from the fact that the Norman cavalry do seem to have been very effective, and the Muslims are frightened of them and couldn't withstand them. But also, we don't have any details about when and where these battles were properly fought. I just thought I'd show you a couple of 12th century Fatimid, which is, they are the Western Muslims, effectively. Pictures of them just to show, you know, on the left you've got a horseman. If you notice, he's holding his lance. It looks like he's riding a camel. He's not. He is riding a horse. He's holding his lance held parallel, very much like you see on the Bayeux Tapestry, though whether he used it for charging a couched lance under the arm, don't know. And in the middle there, you've got somebody who represents an infantryman who's actually making a pretty good job of a leopard at that particular. All we know is that the Normans were extremely successful. And this is another quite famous one, again, of Fatimid, in other words, Western Muslims. You can see they've got a combination of arms there, archers, spearmen, and cavalry. These were decisively defeated at the Battle of Ascalon in 1099 by a Crusader army. So the Arabs don't seem to have been able to withstand very successfully. That is, the Arabs were not all Muslims, and I'll make a point about that later, because there are other types of Muslims who are much more dangerous. But what I wanted to do was go on and just talk about the Byzantines, because I think because we've got a really detailed account by a lady called Anna Komnena, Byzantine princess, the daughter of Alexius I Komnenos, who rules 1071 to 1108. So, you know, across the period that we're talking about and across the Crusade period. And that little map was from my Atlas of medieval warfare, shows the attack from southern Italy into northern Greece, Albania, and above it is the Battle of Duratzo, which was a very important battle, although it didn't decide the war, and again, one for which we've got details. But because I'm conscious of lack of time, I'm going to leave that to the end and see how much time I've got at the end, because I've got some new material which I haven't really used before, and I'd like to go on and talk about as regards how the Byzantines, who after all had, you know, trained forces, a tradition of military manuals, and some very experienced generals, how they tried to handle the Normans. I'll come back to that. And one of the things I wanted to look at was, it's actually an event that took place on the First Crusade. Now, the Byzantines had the same problem as anybody else did against the Normans, that it was very difficult to get people to stand up to charging cavalry. By that, I mean their own cavalry, but also the Byzantines, they lacked a lot of good heavy infantry, which is one of the reasons they recruited the Varangians, who are effectively, you know, like the Anglo-Danes. And indeed, after the Norman conquest, many Anglo-Danes went to Constantinople to join the Varangian Guard, and we have names and dates and places of the people who did that because they'd lost their lands in England. So you've got the Varangian Guard, but the rest of them, Anna Komnene tends to talk about people who are peltasts. Now, because this is a society of ancients, everybody will have a sort of an idea in their head about the late Hellenistic character known as a peltast, who's a kind of lightly armed spearman, possibly with javelins and so on. Whether Anna, who's writing hundreds of years later, means the same thing, she does consciously write and in an archaic way. So, for example, she calls the Franks the Celts throughout. And so I've translated that to Franks because that's not a very sensible word to use for the 11th or 12th century. And she calls the Turks the Scyths, the Scythians. Anyway, but so what does she know about peltasts? Well, I think we can accept that a peltast is a more lightly armed infantryman, possibly using javelins, shield and javelins. Now, whether they used a bow as well, it's not entirely clear. But this is a really nice little quote, which comes from Easter. This is Easter week of 1097, outside the walls of Constantinople. Now, as a result, because it's Easter week, nobody really wants to fight. The Franks have turned up. They are outside Constantinople. They want to be paid. They want to be fed. And the Byzantine emperor, who wasn't really expecting a great mob of pilgrims, he was expecting a few mercenaries, is a little at a loss of what to do with them. So there's actually quite a lot of skirmishing along the march. And when they get there, but when they get to Constantinople, Alexis has devised a formation which works. It's worthwhile saying that this is more like a war game, you know, because this is Holy Week. They're all Christians. Nobody wants to spill blood, although some people do get killed. So, but this is a formation which works. So a group of infantrymen come out of the gate of the long walls. As you can see, most carrying bows, but some of them wielding long spears. And to make a violent charge against the enemy, they were to be drawn up in such a way that each spearman had two peltasts to protect him on either side. In this formation, they would advance at a walking pace, but send ahead a few skilled archers to shoot at the Franks from a distance. As they get to short range, the officers were to signal to the archers accompanying them to shoot thick volleys of arrows at the horses, not at the riders, and gallop. And now presumably she's talking now about the cavalry, because infantry don't gallop, at full speed against the infantry. So although it's not very tidy description, I think this is a combined armed attempt to deal with the Franks. Now, whether the Franks are fully up for it, because they know that the next day is Good Friday, you know, whether they're fully up for a fight, I don't know. But what she says is the idea was partly to break the full force of the Frankish attack by wounding their mounts. They would not find it easy to ride in this condition, and partly, and this is more important, to avoid killing Christians. Right? So this is my War Games reconstruction of this. Here you've got a group of people on DBX bases, and a half base at the back there, and on the left you've got the combined arms advancing with two spearmen at the back, and then 4 peltasts. I mean, okay, maybe they were supposed to stand in between, but it doesn't really matter. And then the archers at the front, and the archers can come out and shoot and then withdraw. And on the right, you've got them in a defensive formation. And it may be, of course, that the spearmen would even kneel down and project their spears while the javelins are thrown over the top. Anyway, however you think about it, the Normans or the Franks don't break this formation. So cunning old Alexius does actually find a way of holding the Franks up. And then I'm just going to go on and talk a bit more about the interaction between the Franks and the Byzantines. When the Byzantines make peace with the Franks in 1097, and they're going to send them across to the Asian side to march on to Antioch and then Jerusalem, they have to make an oath to him. And then when they've made that oath to submit to his authority, he gives them advice. Bohemond, the great Norman commander, and others were sent for and warned about the things likely to happen on the journey. He gave them profitable advice. They were instructed in the methods normally used by the Turks in battle and told how they should draw up a battle line, how to lay ambushes, advised not to pursue so far when the enemy ran away in flight. And this is because the most potent weapon that Alexius has got is probably not his own native troops, but the Turks and Turkomen who are nomadic horse archers that he recruits. His army included Alan, Turkish, and Pecheneg cavalry, and there is a description which relates to Bohemond's second invasion of northern Greece in 1107 about how he tries to use them. Now, the Pechenegs are a nomadic group of tribes that got pushed onto the Eurasian steppe by the Turks. And although they got bullied by the Turks, that doesn't make them any less dangerous. And Alexius actually has to fight serious campaigns against the Pechenegs in the 1090s before the Crusade in order to bring them to heel. But anyway, this is how he tries to use them. The Pechenegs went off eagerly, but they accomplished nothing, for the Franks kept their ranks absolutely unbroken and advanced slowly in perfect order. These are not obligatory chargers. These are people who know what they're doing. They're not going to hair off after a bunch of scummy horse archers. When both armies were close enough for battle, the Pechenegs could no longer shoot their arrows in the face of the enemy's violent charge and fled before them at once. The Turks wanted to help them and put in an attack on their own account, but the Franks, not the least worried by their intervention, fought even more fiercely. In this particular encounter, some Byzantine cavalry does come up and hit the disordered Franks. And as a result, the enemy were utterly beaten. That doesn't happen very often, but this is something that Anna can talk about. And she also says the enemy were utterly beaten and pursued as far as Milos. Many of the ordinary soldiers were wiped out, as well as some of their leaders. Some of the distinguished counts were taken prisoner, and she's got named. But it's worthwhile remembering that the ordinary soldiers, by which I think we mean the foot soldiers, who never appear in any of the accounts, are actually there. They are there, but on this occasion, just to be beaten up. There's another account of how Alexius tried to deal with the Franks by using archers, and this is outside the Dyrrhachium during the second campaign, and this is what he says about how to fight Bohemond. He advised his commanders about the number of men required on the plain of Dyrrhachium to fight Bohemond and the type of battle formation they should adopt as they came down from the hills behind the city. Quote, this is all the Byzantine force. They're not really saying whether this is sort of the ordinary Byzantine cavalry or just the horse archers, were to make frequent charges on horseback and then withdraw. This maneuver was to be repeated often while they shot arrows, but the lancers were to move slowly to their rear so that the horse archers should they be swept far back, might be helped and at the same time strike at any Frank who happened to come within reach. The horse archers were issued what it was described as a plentiful supply of arrows and told not to be at all niggardly with their use. They were to shoot to shoot at the horses rather than the Franks, for their armor and coats of mail made them almost, if not entirely, invulnerable. To shoot at the riders, therefore, would, in his opinion, be a waste of arrows and absolutely ridiculous. Frankish armor consists of a tunic interwoven with iron rings linked to one another. The iron is of good quality, capable of resisting an arrow and giving protection to the soldier's body. The armor is supplemented by a shield, not round but long, broad at the top and tapering to a point. Inside it's slightly curved. The outside is smooth and shiny, and it has a flashing bronze boss. Any arrow, whether it be Pecheneg or Turkish or shot by the arms of a giant, will be repelled by the shield and rebound against the shooter. It was for these reasons, I guess, that the emperor, having experience of Frankish armor and our arrows, ordered them not to worry about the men, but rather to attack the horses. There was another reason for shooting at the horses. The Franks, when they dismounted, would be easily handled. A mounted knight is irresistible. He would bore his way through the walls of Babylon, but when he dismounts, he becomes anyone's plaything. So essentially, everybody respected the Franks' charge, the Normans' charge. How do you deal with it? Shoot their horses. The Normans don't always allow you to do that. And so Alexius, being a cunning Byzantine, came up with some other ideas. And one of them was to develop what I call a wheelbarrow of war. Could there be anything more fearsome? According to Anna, the experience of the previous battle with Robert convinced that the first charge of the Norman cavalry was irresistible. So he adopted a new strategy. Lighter wagons, smaller than usual, were made, and on each 4 poles were fixed. Armed infantry were stationed near them, so that when the Latins made their assault on the Roman line at a full gallop, these men would push the wagons forward and from underneath. In this way, a continuous line of the enemy would be broken up. Right. Now, when I first encountered these things, it was actually in Alfred Duggan's book about Count Bohemond. Some of you may have read Alfred Duggan. He's an absolutely marvelous historical writer. He's writing probably sort of, in the early part of the 20th century, the mid 20th century. He was an old cavalryman himself. And he really understands and writes pragmatically about it. He described these things as scythe chariots. Now, you can understand why he did, because the Greek is a bit elusive, but what they actually were plaustrella, as they're known in Latin, and they're not wagons, they're carts. The difference between having a 2-wheel base rather than 4, it made them very maneuverable. The 4 wheels projecting out the back of the vehicle, enabling it to be swung round rather like a wheelbarrow. Projecting front, although Anna does not say this, were a number of spears, usually 4 to 6 in number, creating a very dangerous obstacle for cavalry. They were used by the Milanese forces against Frederick Barbarossa at Legnano in 1176, and indeed, as Tom Richardson, who was a member of the society, may still be, expert from the Royal Armoury, pointed out, at Cressy in 1346, that the main line at Cressy was not just archers and men-at-arms. There were actually carts in action, and we know that because we know the bits to make the carts were sent across from England prior to the 1346 campaign. However, this is my reconstruction of the Byzantine one. Come on, there you are. Here they are, the wheelbarrows of war. And there you can see on the left, the war cart being moved, and on the right, the war cart deployed. And this is based on my understanding of what they looked like, some reconstructions that were made and I talked about at the conference last year, and also just sort of an interpretation. If you look at the front of the wheelbarrow of war, you'll see that it's got a strange dog-headed figure on it. Now, there's a reason for that, because that is St. Christopher. And there's one particular representation of St. Christopher is as Christophoros Kainokephalos, the Christopher with the dog head. And St. Christopher, as I'm sure you know, is the patron saint of bus drivers, the patron saint of anybody who has anything to do with transportation, right? And so therefore, I thought it was an appropriate picture. That's taken from a Byzantine icon. You can see that the saint has a holy book in his hand. So that's my war cart as I've imagined it. Right. This particular plan fails. And why does the plan with the war carts fail? Because the Normans simply ride round them. They don't ride at the front. They do their reconnaissance and they ride round them, which again sort of says something a lot about the fact that these people really know what they're doing. They're not headless, head-banging chargers. There's actually, Alexius attempts another. I'm going to finish in the next couple of minutes. Alexius attempts another technique. In this time, he used iron caltrops. Now, I don't have to explain to the Society of Ancients members what caltrops are. I mean, they're three pronged metal pieces that can be thrown on the ground, so a spike always falls upwards. But again, he sows a field with caltrops. The Normans take one look and go round the flanks. So all the really cunning things that he tries to do don't work. And then these are the iron caltrops. I mean, it's a perfectly sensible thing to do, and they're used throughout history. And in fact, I remember going to with a school party to the Imperial War Museum and being shown these things, and I was the only member of the party, being an inky military historian swap, who knew what they were, and they were used in the First World War. So these are timeless and successful things, but you've got to be surprised by them. If you're not surprised, then they will succeed. So then they can be easily dealt with. How much time? Yeah, I have got a bit more to say, but I'm going to just sort of tidy. I'm going to end it there, but with just a particular thing about how the sort of the tactical sort of dialectic works. But this is on one occasion, Bohemond uses normal tactics to a frontal attack, swooping down like a whirlwind, which successfully drives the Byzantines off. So then they were told not to fight at close quarters, but to shoot at the horses rather than the riders. So this particular theme about this appears at least several times in Anna's work. And again, it says that when on horseback, the Franks are unbeatable, but when they dismount, partly because of their huge shields, partly because of the spurs on their boots, or in a more modern translation, it actually says because of the long toes of their shoes, which were indeed fashionable in the early 12th century, and their ungainly walk, that they become very dispirited and altogether different as their former enthusiasm dies down. And so one thing, why didn't Alexius try Greek fire? I've got a couple of things that I've made with RAFM Greek fire throwers, and a couple of dumb Varangians who are too dull to know how dangerous it is to be operating them, which I hope to use the next time my Byzantines fight the Normans. Anyway, I'm going to stop there so there's time for questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was terrific. One or two questions that have come through to me directly, and a couple of other questions that I wanted to ask. One thing. So I was at the Battle of Hastings reenactment back in 2006.
I was there.
One of the big years when they got a lot of cavalry there. And one of the things I observed then was that the way they were simulating attacking the infantry, and I've no idea whether this was based on anything at all, so I'd be interested in your comments, but that they would charge in relatively small groups up the hill towards the the line of infantry. When the line of infantry didn't break, they essentially just swerved left and right it split into two groups, left and right, rode along the line, jabbing their spears a little bit at the infantrymen, and then just turned back again in a kind of back down the hill. And it seemed that was a way that they might well have attacked. It seemed a very reasonable interpretation of how cavalry who realise the foot are not actually going to break would then operate. I mean, do we have any evidence for the small unit tactics when they don't break the infantry, when they arrive and the infantry don't break?
Well, I mean, I think I was there in 2006 as well, and there were probably about 300 horses, and I can remember how the ground shook when they charged up the hill. It was really impressive. But so, so there is that. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole point about sending in small groups is that they can feint, and in the sense of that, if the infantry obligingly break, then that's just, that's it's all wonderful. But yeah, I think what the riding along and jabbing is perfectly reasonable. Of course, one of the reasons they could do that with ease is that there probably weren't a lot of English archers in 1066. If you had been facing people with a lot of missile power and a lot of archery, it'd be more difficult. But yes, indeed. I mean, but that's pretty much what the Latin sources close to the event and the old French source a long way away, but with a keen sense of how the cavalry worked, how medieval cavalry worked. Yeah, indeed, advancing in small groups and then swinging around, and as with both using the individual mastery of the horse, that's the French turn, and the group cohesion of what we would call a troop, about 30 horses, would do exactly that. And the fact that the reenactors found themselves doing that really kind of proves my point.
Yeah, I think that's very sounds very, very reasonable. I've got a question here, Matt, which I'll attempt to read out. It says, you refer to the use of a combination of different troop types, archers and spearmen and javelin men. I think that was the Byzantine response.
Yeah,
does hark back, I think, perhaps to some Byzantine formations, historically, the combined.
absolutely. Yeah.
But it said, so the question here says, later in the Albigensian crusade, mercenary troops such as Ribaulds and Routiers combined many different weapons in the same rough units. So for the Normans, in that period, are we really looking at separate troop types being combined, or should we recognize them as actually being in the same unit to start with and making more mixed type of fighting elements within a war games unit? So essentially, were they always in units? Should we just recognize the fact that there were multi-weapons in units anyway, or do you think it was actually specifically different groups being put together specifically for this battle and for this?
No, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And one of the problems about wargaming, of course, is we have to break them up into different units. Although it's possible to have a combined unit with spearmen in the front, archers at the back, and so on. But I think what you have is varieties of types of foot soldier. One type of foot soldier is the spearman. Another type of foot soldier is the javelinman. Another type of foot soldier, who is much to be desired, is archers, who tend to come from forested areas. Though the Byzantines may well have trained people up, but generally you recruited people with specialist skills from specialist areas. And of course, coming into the 11th century, and a product of urban militias, because they've got the craft skills, crossbowmen. Right. So, but the way that the Normans are described at Hastings is the foot soldiers with spears, the missile men, and the cavalry. And as to whether they were gathered in units, I mean, they would have been recruited as a responsibility of a particular lord or baron. By the time you get to the 12th century, and you actually have something called the pipe rolls, which are fairly detailed financial accounts of the English crown, on, for example, that you would find different types of troops recruited. So, for example, on the Welsh marches, you would recruit spearmen, and we know about Welsh spearmen later and so on. Very often, I suspect that medieval military formations, medieval armies, were fairly ad hoc. right? So perhaps you would have to bring them together from their various groups. On the other hand, once people have been fighting on campaign for a while, and certainly William in 1066 and Guiscard in in the 1070s and 80s, they would have had troops who are used to fighting together. And I will use a quote, because Roy would love me to, about the infantry that Robert Guiscard specifically trained up, and which Anna Comnena was very suspicious of. She said, not being satisfied with the men who served with his army from the beginning and had experience in battle, he formed a new army made up of recruits without any consideration of age. From all quarters of Lombardy and Apulia, he gathered them, over and under age, pitiable objects who had never seen armor, even in their dreams, that then, clad in armor, carrying shields, awkwardly drawing bows to which they were completely unused and falling flat on the ground when they were allowed to march. Naturally, these things provided an excuse for incessant trouble in Lombardy. Everywhere one could hear the lamentation of men and the wailing of women who shared in the bad fortune of their menfolk. For one mourned a husband unfit for military service, another a son who knew nothing of war, a third a brother who was just a farmer or occupied in some job. Yet, and this is a really crucial point, yet, however unused to soldiering they were, he trained them daily and hammered his recruits into a disciplined force, right? So, you know, I hope that responds appropriately to the question, because I think it means that the people at the time were thinking about, how do you get decent infantry? I've actually come up, you know, we have these definitions of like heavy infantry, light, heavy infantry. I've actually come up with a new one, which I'm going to use with my Almighty army, which I'm going to call lightweight infantry. Usually represented by, like, you know, three figures on a DBX base. In other words, that these we know that it's possible to have good infantry, and the Byzantines had some good infantry armed with spears and mail coats and so on. But a lot of medieval infantry ain't that good. And you know, and you can't compare a Roman legionary, say, with an 11th century spearman, you know, because they're just totally different animals. Whereas in some war games they might appear quite similar. So you know, so I'm going to introduce lightweight infantry who can't be relied upon to do an awful lot, but might if reasonably trained.
Okay, interesting one. So there's a question here, a couple of questions, similar questions come in, and I guess one that I'm interested in asking as well, and that's, in war games rules, Norman knights are almost always portrayed as, let's use the word irregular.
Yeah.
And what it tends to mean in the rules are that they're not all that maneuverable, they're not all that controllable. They can be very impetuous, and certainly compared to irregular knights of those class regular, which because they didn't charge hard and because they didn't, that very, to me, seems very strange, and it seems to go against. Can
I just say that, right? Well, I hope that what I've done today is prove that the Franks and the Normans, although they were capable of getting out of hand like any cavalry, were often extremely well organized and extremely disciplined, and did what their commanders required of them. Again, if you've got an ad hoc formation of people who haven't worked together, which is something like a crusade produces, you know, the beginning of the Crusades, the Franks are a bit disorganized. By the time they get to Ascalon 2 years later, they absolutely tear a Fatimid army apart by being controlled, and also on the march, they move with infantry and cavalry combined in 9 blocks, 3 by 3 by 3, so they can face in any direction. So yeah, completely reassess your Normans and make them absolutely wonderful and obedient and marvelous. Don't confuse them with Byzantines, who may be obedient but are often prefer to shoot with their bow. If you give somebody a bow, they prefer to fight from a distance. If you give somebody a lance, they don't have any choice. They've got to get up there and stick it in someone, otherwise they're not going to do their job.
Yeah, indeed. A question here, which has been sent through. Is there any evidence that Normans in Byzantine service in the 12th century were drilled or specially trained by the Byzantines? In other words, did they learn from the Byzantines when they were working as mercenaries?
What the Byzantines tended to do, and this is true of the late Roman Empire, was recruit sort of federates and then keep them in their groups for their specific skills. And certainly that's true in Alexius's army. I mean, in the army of Basil the Bulgar Slayer, as I said, the early part of that century, and in the 10th century from which we get the military manuals, I think you can assume a very large army of drilled native troops. By the time you get to after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Byzantines have real trouble recruiting good native cavalry, and so they sort of fall back on having sort of allied troops. They had a commander of the Franks of the specifically. One of them was Robert Crispin, who was a Norman, but in this period in the late 11th century, who specifically led them. And there was a wonderful man called Humbertopolis, which is presumably a man called Fitzhubert, translated back into it, who was also fighting for the Byzantines against the Normans on the Dyrrhachium campaign. So were they trained to fight with the Byzantines? I think probably not. Why spoil their specific skills by trying to mix them in with a bunch of people who are doing something different? I'm welcome to discuss it, preferably over a beer, but that's all I can say for now.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question, and then if there's anything you want to say in summing up, you'd be very welcome to. So the last question I've got here is about the size of the horses that Normans and the knights were riding relative to perhaps cavalry in antiquity. So quoting 15 hands for the Norman horses, whereas maybe 12 to 13 for Roman cavalry. Was that their effectiveness against infantry driven by that, do you think, or was it the tactics, or what was it? Even the lower quality of infantry?
I mean, if cavalry cannot bear down on organized infantry in any period, you just can't do it if the infantry are organized and have decent weapons to oppose you with. It's true that horses got larger throughout. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at some of the illustrations or carvings of classical horses, they're really quite small. But when you come to the 11th century, the Norman horses, I mean, so 15 hands is more like a maximum than a minimum. And so, so you're talking about horses who are really quite small at the shoulder, but they can be quite broad. And you don't get big horses really until there are breeding programs in the 16th century, or more specifically in the 17th century. When you see a standard horse nowadays, a standard riding horse, a 16 or 17 hand horse, a hunter, is not exceptional, but it would have been unthought of in the period we're talking about. So you're dealing with a different animal. On the other hand, if you've ever been to see a pony race or anything like that, if you've got a small horse, it's often a lot more maneuverable. So I wouldn't knock the small horses, but as I say, if anybody knows anything about horses, I know Phil Barker, of course, famously knows a lot about them, but if you see a Welsh cob, which is really quite small but very chunky, you are not going to stand in its way unless you're disciplined. And if it does get amongst you, then they can do what police horses are trained to do nowadays, which is kind of shoulder make up a formation. But of course, the police horses we see nowadays are absolutely massive. Yeah, but then of course need to kill you. Well, probably not. Better ask Blair Peach about that. Ooh.
That's taking us back a bit,
isn't it?
Well,
anyway, no, I mean, thanks very much for listening is all I have to say. I was going to say a little bit about the Battle of Duratzo, but I don't think it matters. I think I made my main point about how decent infantry can withstand the most powerful charging cavalry. On the other hand, charging cavalry, it's not the only thing they can do. Properly trained or coordinated, they can pull the infantry apart and then break them up that way.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matt. That was lovely, lovely presentation, and maybe we'll save Duratzo for another time.
Yeah, I think we've done
Oh, he's frozen.
Did we do?
Matt seems to be freezing, so I'm gonna...
Roy and I did a reenactment of Duratzo.
Yeah.
Am I freezing?
You were freezing, I'm afraid,
so
Matt.
farewell.
Farewell.